The Japanese commander swore the Tarawa could not be taken by 1,000,000 men in 100 years, but a handful of U.S. Marines took it in 3 days. They were the gallant breed. Millions have thrilled to the Corps' history in the hit television special, The Gallant Breed. Its combat history so powerful that the Marine Corps Historical Foundation has endorsed this special offer. You may now obtain video cassettes featuring all 3 thrilling hours. With E.G. Marshall as narrator, you'll fight alongside our Marines from the Revolution to Khe Sanh. You'll be there on the bloody beaches and in the death-filled jungles with the gallant breed. This fabulous collector's item, 3 cassettes, is just $89.95 plus $5 shipping. Portions of the proceeds to the Marine Corps Historical Foundation. Write, or better yet, call the foundation at 1-800-336-0291. That's 1-800-336-0291. Do it. Semper Fi.
And toughest battle ever fought by Marine aviation was to get into the air and stay there. From the beginning, there is always that question, should the Marine Corps have an air arm of its own? In providing an answer during its long and seemingly endless fight for existence, Marine aviation has compiled a proud roster of its own heroes and their stunning accomplishments.
The first Marine aviator was Lieutenant Alfred A. Cunningham, who soloed on August 1st, 1912. Cunningham was only one of the Marine senior aviators to fight for the Corps, both in the air and in the corridors of Congress. Marine aviation got its first real testing in World War I. It started in France with missions flown with the RAF. Eventually, the Marines got 4 squadrons of 2-place de Havilland bombers into the air. During the war, Marine pilots never got to support their own ground forces, their avowed mission. But they did get their first confirmed air-to-air kills, 4 of them. And Lieutenant Ralph Talbot and Gunnery Sergeant Robert G. Robinson became the first in a long line of aviation Marines to be awarded the Medal of Honor. During the 1920s, Marine flyers began their great tradition of aerial support for ground troops. In Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, they supported Leathernecks fighting against what some called rebels and others called bandits. Their first dive bombing attacks were made in Nicaragua. They also gained experience in air resupply and medical evacuation by plane. In the 1930s, Marine aviation was finally assigned some well-defined roles, including support of Marine forces in amphibious landing operations and as replacement squadrons on board Navy carriers, and just in time. There were only 641 Marine aviators on December 7th, 1941. On that fateful day, 47 of the 48 Marine planes at Ever Field were destroyed on the ground. On the following day, Japanese planes attacked the tiny Marine garrison on Wake Island. 7 of Major Paul A. Putnam's 12 F-4F Wildcats were destroyed on the ground. The survivors flew to glory. For 2 weeks, the intrepid Marine aviators, with those planes still flyable, and using wrecked Wildcats for repair parts, tore into vastly superior Japanese forces until Wake was overwhelmed and the last Wildcat shot from the sky. In June 1942, a powerful Japanese invasion fleet, including 4 aircraft carriers, was poised to take Midway Island, a stepping stone to Hawaii. Among Midway's defenders were 64 Marine aircraft, including 21 obsolescent F-2A Brewster Buffaloes. The gallant Marines who flew out to intercept the enemy were the victims of poor equipment and insufficient training time. Their losses were staggering, but the enemy aircraft shot down by Marine pilots at Midway greatly reduced the weight of attack the Japanese were able to throw against the U.S. carriers. In the end, Navy dive bombers caught the Japanese planes rearming on their flight decks, and 4 carriers went down. Midway was saved. But the Japanese bastion at Rabaul continued to menace New Guinea and Australia. To halt Japan's Pacific advance, the Americans launched an attack on Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the nearby Solomon Islands. When the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches on August 7, 1942, the situation was desperate from the first. In a savage night action off Savo Island, the Japanese all but annihilated the screening force of Allied cruisers. The Navy's carriers, considered too vulnerable in the confined waters surrounding the island, were withdrawn. So were the transports with their vital supplies. The air defense of Henderson Field was left initially to a handful of Marine pilots. The first planes were flown onto Guadalcanal by Marines. Their average age was 20. Most had received only about 275 hours of flight instruction and little, if any, tactical operational training. They were about to face veteran Japanese Navy pilots who averaged 800 hours flying time even before Pearl Harbor. For 3 months, the Cactus Air Force, as it was called, mostly leatherneck planes and pilots, but with some Navy and Army Air Force flyers as well, bore the brunt of Guadalcanal's aerial defense. The Japanese bombed from the air, shelled from the sea, and attacked on the ground. At the same time, Japanese transports and destroyers, the so-called Tokyo Express, ran reinforcements from Rabaul down the narrow passage called the Slot. Overhead, Marine planes fought the escorting fighters relentlessly. Brigadier General Roy S. Geiger's Cactus Air Force didn't have enough of anything but heroes. The kills and the medals of honor mounted. While the fighter pilots got most of the glory, the dive and torpedo bombers got most of the enemy ships, troops, and supplies. The F-4F Wildcats were heavily outclassed by the nimble Zeros, but Marine pilots made up for that with the superior toughness and firepower of their rugged Wildcats against the easily flamed Japanese fighter.
During one period of intense combat, lasting 122 days, Marine airmen had destroyed 427 enemy planes while losing 118 of their own and 20 pilots. But the myth of the Zero's invincibility had ended.
Now a new weapon arrived for the Marines. They called it the bent-wing bird. The Japanese would call it Whistling Death. The Chance Vought F-4U Corsair was the first Marine plane that could outspeed and outperform the agile Zero. As experience and time in the Corsair grew, Marine pilots developed an advantage they never relinquished. On August 5th, 1943, the airfield at Mundanu, Georgia fell. Kalamidgara soon followed. From Munda, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, who had molded a bunch of orphans from other Marine air units into his famous Black Sheep Squadron, became a terror. He and his pilots prowled the area around Bougainville, attacking Japanese airfields, aircraft, and shipping. As Japan's reserve of veteran pilots dwindled, her planes flamed faster and faster. With the landing of Marines at Bougainville, the doom of Rabaul was sealed and the Solomons campaign successfully completed. Rabaul was flanked and neutralized. The Central Pacific lay open. In the Solomons, 8 medals of honor went to Marine pilots. John Smith, Robert Gaylor, Joe Bauer, Joe Foss, Jeff DeBlanc, James Sweat, Ken Walsh, Greg Boyington. Marine amphibious forces battled across the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, adding heroic and bloody chapters to marine history at Tarawa and Roy Namur, at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. But with no carriers of their own and few land bases, Marine flyers had to fly mission after mission against the bypassed islands in the Central Pacific and the Solomons, keeping the sea lanes secure and newly won bases safe. The coming of the deadly kamikaze late in 1944 saw Marine squadrons flying off the Navy's fleet carriers to help defeat the suicide attacks. Losses to accidents and weather were fearful, as the beleaguered Marine flyers tried to cram months of carrier landing training into days. The hunters were hunted as well. The fleet ships were hit repeatedly by the dread kamikazes. 65 Marines of its 2 Corsair squadrons died on the burning Franklin alone. But the Marine squadrons endured, their contributions critical to the defeat of Japan's fearful suicide weapon. Near the war's end, Marines finally operated from flat tops of their own, tiny CVE escorts with flight decks 300 feet shorter than the big fleet carriers. As the United States moved closer to the Japanese home islands, Marine aviation was reunited with Marine ground and really came into its own. It had now developed ground support to an art. At Peleliu, Marine aircraft blasted the Japanese holed up in the ridges. On Iwo Jima, they were told to scrape your bellies on the beach. They did, often hurtling through their own naval gunfire. While supporting U.S. Army infantry in the Philippines and both Marines and soldiers in the war's last campaign at Okinawa, Marine flyers proved devastating to the Japanese ground forces. From carriers and from airfields on Okinawa, Marine aviators helped take the battle to the enemy all around the East China Sea. They attacked both Japanese shipping and the kamikaze bases and carried a major part of the air offensive against the Japanese mainland. By midsummer of 1945, the Flying Marines were just hitting full stride when, suddenly, World War II ended.
America's period of peace would be brief. On June 25, 1950, Communist North Korean forces launched a surprise attack, driving deep into South Korea.
Once again, in a national emergency, the most combat-ready force was the Marines. From bases in California, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade was assembled. It included Marine Air Group 33. In just 6 weeks, the Leatherneck Force was deployed and committed to action in South Korea. Marine aviators found themselves in a familiar role, defending with scant resources their heavily engaged ground forces. They flew in direct support of Marine and Army infantry, who were clinging to an ever-shrinking perimeter around the southern port of Pusan. Marine squadrons and light carriers came into their own. 2 air squadrons, flying 60 old Corsairs from the Sicily and Badoin Strait off the Korean coastline, battered the North Korean forces pressing in on the beleaguered perimeter. One admiring soldier described their feats, saying, "The Marines on our left were a sight to behold. They had squadrons of air in direct support. They used it like artillery." Delivering rockets, bombs, and napalm, the Marine flyers were stalwart in the successful defense of the Pusan perimeter. On September 15, 1950, Marine aviators flew close air support for the 1st Marine Division as it spearheaded General Douglas MacArthur's brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon. Marine planes helped reduce the island of Walmi-do, guarding Incheon Harbor. They laid 500-pound bombs less than 100 yards in front of the advancing Marine infantry. As the war continued, new helicopter tactics were added to those that had been in rigorous and far-sighted development at Quantico since the late 1940s. Marine choppers flew reconnaissance, supply, and medical evacuation missions. They also pioneered the rapid lifting of troops in Korea for tactical movements. The battlefield had a new dimension, vertical envelopment. On November 27, 1950, near the Manchurian border, the UN 8th Army offensive in the West came to a rude halt when communist Chinese troops that had entered North Korea to join the war suddenly attacked. To the 8th Army's east, near the Chosin Reservoir, strong Chinese forces also attacked elements of Major General O.P. Smith's 1st Marine Division. The surrounded Leathernecks were ordered to withdraw 68 miles, much of it down a narrow mountain road to the port of Hungnam. They would be under brutal attack almost every mile of the way. Often, the extra firepower needed in a desperate moment of defense was in the wings of a Corsair. One of the secrets of the astonishing success of the Marines' fighting withdrawal was the use of the Tactical Air Control Party, in which an experienced Marine pilot with the ground forces coordinated the airstrikes against enemy targets. This technique protected the retreating columns so well that, so long as good weather held, it was virtually impossible for the enemy to wage an effective attack during daylight hours. Thus supported by Marine Air, with a generous assist from Navy and Air Force flyers, the gallant 1st Division Marines reached the safety of Hungnam and were evacuated from North Korea by Christmas Eve, 1950. As the ground war settled into stalemate around the 38th parallel, the Marines introduced night and bad weather bombing techniques that allowed bombs and other ordnance to be delivered onto targets entirely under the control of electronic equipment on the ground. The Marines flew their ground support missions mostly in older Panthers, Sky Raiders, Banshees, and Corsairs. Still, Marine pilots managed to down 14 enemy planes during their rare opportunities for aerial combat. But while flying hot F-86 Sabre jets as exchange pilots with the Air Force, Marine aviators racked up an impressive 21 MiG kills. Major John F. Bolt became a jet ace with 6 victories. Another Leatherneck aviator with 3 kills was future astronaut Major John Glenn. In July 1953, Korea became the first of America's modern wars to end at a conference table instead of on the battlefield.
During the latter half of the 1950s, Marine aviation continued the development of its weapons and tactics. In 1962, Marine helicopters joined the military advisory group in South Vietnam.
The deployment was to provide the South Vietnamese with a combat lift capability to help their effectiveness against a determined communist guerrilla movement. In May 1962, the 1st Marine Helicopter Squadron to arrive in Vietnam began operations at Soc Trang, 60 miles south of Saigon. Later that year, the Marine choppers moved north to the airbase at Da Nang, which was being increasingly menaced by guerrillas. In April 1965, Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 531 joined the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, committed at Da Nang as the first American ground combat troops in Vietnam. In May, the Marines landed at Chu Lai, south of Da Nang, and established a unique airbase, one that initially used carrier arresting gear and catapult techniques. Despite its short length, the field could handle the hot jets with ease. In Vietnam, more than any other war, marine aviation was able to achieve its original concept of supporting marine infantry. Flying sophisticated jets like the new F-4 Phantom, they laid explosives and napalm on the enemy. For many Marines, Vietnam was to be a helicopter war. Rampaging gunships and swift vertical envelopment operations changed the nature of the battlefield. Low-level ground support missions, exposed to every sort of enemy weapon, took a special kind of courage. Evacuation and supply missions for ground units caught deep in the brush had to be flown instantly and constantly, regardless of weather, danger, or fatigue. Often, extraction by helicopter was the only way an engaged force could be withdrawn. Despite added armor and increased firepower, casualties among Marine air crews were high. But they did the job. In 1968, their peak year of involvement, Marine helicopters flew a staggering 632,000 sorties. This against 90,000 for fixed-wing aircraft. During that period, 939,000 troops and 109,000 tons of supplies were lifted. In the Communists' bloody New Year's Tet Offensive in 1968, Marine aviation closely supported Marine ground units during the heroic recapture of the provincial capital at Hue. Then, at Khe Sanh, a remote in-country firebase, the North Vietnamese laid siege to the Marine garrison. Evacuation and resupply were possible by air alone. The Strip was under constant fire. The gallant Marine pilots and their Air Force counterparts persisted until the siege was broken. The cost was high, but their action was called the premier logistical air feat of the Vietnam War. For the Marine aviators, Vietnam was not a dogfighting war. Most of their missions were flown far from Hanoi and Haiphong, where the MiGs did their parading. But as in Korea, Leatherneck aviators managed to gain a few aerial victories while flying rare missions deep into North Vietnam. By 1969, their first-to-fight role fulfilled, Marine air and infantry began pulling out of Vietnam, leaving the war to wind its way to still another conference table. The final Marine involvements in Southeast Asia were sad but brilliantly executed. In April 1975, Operation Eagle Pull sent 300 Marines to the collapsing Cambodian capital at Phnom Penh. They lifted out 276 Americans and other nationals. Later that month, there was the larger and more difficult evacuation of Saigon. There, 175 Marines had held off panicking crowds as Marine choppers airlifted 5,593 Vietnamese and 1,373 Americans to safety. South Vietnamese helicopters had to be pushed over the side to make room for the arriving refugees. The Marine Force in readiness soon found employment in another section of the world, this time as part of a multinational peacekeeping force in Beirut, Lebanon, between 1982 and 1984. During the mission, Marine helicopters were workhorses, both in transporting troops and supplies, and as a deterrent to open attack. Unfortunately, the suicide truck bombing of the Marine barracks at Beirut International Airport on October 23, 1983, was anything but open. 241 American servicemen died in the disaster. But there would not be time to mourn their dead before the Marines would again be called upon to land on a hostile shore. Even as the relief battalion sailed toward beleaguered Beirut, the Navy Marine Corps team was diverted to yet another hotspot. Early on October 25th, the Marines lifted off for a landing on the island of Grenada. A stable left-wing government had been bloodily overthrown in the small Caribbean nation. The amphibious action, in which Marine Air played a key role, prevented the takeover of a bomber-capable jet port pointed at the U.S. and the heart of the Caribbean by a hostile pro-Castro government. Resistance from Cuban and local troops was put down with light casualties by joint Marine Corps and U.S. Army action. In its continuing partnership with the Navy, Marine Aviation has adopted new aircraft well suited to its mission. The AV-8B Harrier is a revolutionary fighter bomber with swiveling jet nozzles that permit vertical and short field operations. In land actions, where airfields are likely to be early casualties, the Harrier can take off and land in barely its own length. Capable of being airborne within 90 seconds of startup, it can carry heavy ordnance in operations against a variety of targets. As a supersonic fighter, the Marines have the versatile F-18 Hornet. The Hornet is an unsurpassed combination of dogfighter and attack bomber. Shore-based or carrier-based, it is just one more example of the close ties between the Navy and Marine Corps. Early in 1986, 2 Marine squadrons of FA-18A Hornets and a detachment of EA-6B Prowlers operated as integral components of a U.S. Navy task force in the Gulf of Sidra in operations against Libya. Two years later, the versatility of marine aviation was once again demonstrated, this time in the volatile Persian Gulf region. A Marine light attack helicopter squadron was instrumental to the success of the U.S. retaliatory attacks on 2 Iranian oil platforms that had been used to help direct Iranian attacks on civilian shipping. Today, more than 3/4 of a century since it began, Marine aviation continues to be an inseparable partner of the Marine Corps air-ground team. Marine aviation looks to its past and its future, proud and ready.
The proudest thing in my life is to have been a part of Marine aviation and those heroic flyers who fought so well and sacrificed so much to gain the success of American arms. As the Marine hymn sings it, if the Army and the Navy ever look on heaven scenes, they'll find the streets are guarded by United States Marines. And if they look up, I'm certain they'll find a few of us flying air cover. Semper Fi.